Good evening. We just sang that song together. And the end of it says, "When shall I dwell in thee?" Talking about Zion. I was thinking to myself, well, I guess when we die is when we'll get there. So we're not in a rush to do that, but we want that at the same time. So I was thinking about that because the whole point of the song is the fact that we're setting our heart on something else. Our heart is not down here. Our heart is somewhere else. So this morning, we're going to be talking about some of the things that take place in our lives, some of the natural occurrences that happen within the human heart. You can see from the title of the lesson, Uniqueness and Unity. And the way I'm going to present that to you right now is to help you understand a little bit of the meaning behind these terms for the lesson, because we as humans have two things happening within us at the same time. There's a simultaneous phenomenon that happens. The desire to be unique, but also the desire to have unity. And what I mean by that is the desire to be special, the desire to kind of have a certain type of glory. We all like approval. We all like attention. We all like to be praised when we do good things. That's just a human attribute. But we also want to be a part of something bigger than ourselves. And those two things combined often are at odds. They often cause a lot of issues. And that is, if you take a look at the very commonly quoted verse from Proverbs chapter 4, verse 23, where the wise man writes, "Keep thy heart with all diligence, for out of it are the issues of life." I do believe that's the kind of thing that he is addressing, the need in the human heart to want to be special, to want to be unique, but also this desire to be accepted. And as a Christian, that's going to take place, but it usually ends up being at odds with the rest of the world, and it causes us to have problems and issues that come as a result of that. So out of it are the issues of life, and these are some of the issues that we have to deal with. And the main text that we're going to use to get us going is from John chapter 12 and verse 42. John chapter 12 and verse 42. Jesus is nearing the end of his physical life. He's nearing the end of his ministry. The Passover feast is right around the corner. He's in Jerusalem. Preparations are being made, doing a lot of teaching. The heat is turning up, which is fitting for the temperature of the room right now. It's nice and warm in here. I did leave the windows open all afternoon, so just imagine how much worse it would be if I didn't let the air flow in here. But the heat is turning up on the ministry of the Christ, and a lot of people are starting to actually take notice of Jesus, this new character who has come up and has this great power and this amazing reputation. However, we don't like a lot of things going on with this guy too. We don't like what's going on around him. So John chapter 12, verses 42 and 43 tells us about some of the people, specifically the chief rulers. So let's take a look at it now. John chapter 12, verse 42, it says, "Nevertheless, among the chief rulers also many believed on him. But because of the Pharisees, they did not confess him, lest they should be put out of the synagogue. For they loved the praise of men more than the praise of God. Now, this is an extension of something we talked about last week in the Sunday evening session last week. I took verses 37 to the end of this chapter and showed a classification of 3 different types of faith. There's those that had no faith because most of the people just rejected Jesus. Then we have this type of faith, which I took us to James chapter 2, where James talks about faith without works is dead. And this is the kind of faith that we are reading about right now, that we just read about, the dead faith, because they did have a faith, but that faith was rendered useless as a result of their inability or their unwillingness to seek things of God more than of men. And then, of course, there is the living faith, the fruitful faith that produces fruit and inevitably salvation. So, in verse 42, I want to reread that and draw some things out of it as we read it a little bit more slowly and make a few comments. So it says in verse 42, nevertheless, among the chief rulers, many believed on him. Okay. And then we have the but statement. But because of the Pharisees, they did not confess him, lest they should be put out of the synagogue. So there is a potential for rejection as a result, and that potential is almost inevitable, and that is one of the things that we need to be mindful of as Christians here in the 21st century, because by confessing the Christ, we will be inevitably rejected and put out of certain classifications of people. Certain groups of people will not accept that. And if you're that crazy Bible-thumping person who's always talking about Jesus, people don't want to hear that. People don't like that. People don't want to be exposed, and that's one of the things that Jesus uses as a theme throughout the whole book of John. In John chapter 3, he actually talks about those that are of the darkness hate the light because they don't want to be exposed by the light. That's what the light does. It's illuminating, and most people don't want to be illuminated. And so in this instance, these people, which is a kind of a weird inversion, they had a sense of light within them. They had a belief in them. They had faith in them, which I know is representation of everybody here, because I know that everyone in this room, because I know, well, I mean, I'm assuming the lovely people that I don't really know that well have a faith in Christ. But we don't always show it. We don't always confess it, depending on who may be in the room. And of course, we want to refine that part of our lives, because even though these chief rulers, some of them, had some inner realization of the light, some inner illumination, they wouldn't let it change them because of fear. They wouldn't let it change their outer behavior because of fear. And that fear is real. Now, go back to the 9th chapter of the book of John. I'm going to show you an instance where that is deliberately described. In John chapter 9, just a few pages back, Jesus heals the blind man, and it, of course, was a miracle, and this man by reputation was blind. And what ended up happening, of course, is the Pharisees, which were mentioned in our 12th chapter. The Pharisees were trying to find ways to discredit Jesus. They're trying to find ways to uproot his popularity and his glory, inevitably. And so what ends up happening is he's being questioned, this blind man is being questioned for his healing, and they even bring his parents along. And I want us to notice his parents and their actual response to the Pharisees. So John chapter 9, beginning in verse 20, it says, his parents answered them and said, "We know that this is our son, and that he was born blind. But by what means he now sees, we know not. Or who has opened his eyes, we know not." Now watch this. "He is of age, ask him. He shall speak for himself." So if you just stop right there, we have the parents kind of dancing around the obvious answer. Dancing around it. Let's tell you what we do know, okay? We know that this is our son. So quit telling us obvious stuff, okay? And we know that he was blind and now he sees, and they refused to acknowledge the miracle, the power, the beauty, the grace. And then it is explained in verse 22. These words spoke his parents because they feared the Jews. For the Jews had agreed already that if any man did confess that he was Christ, he should be put out of the synagogue. And in verse 23, therefore said his parents, "He is of age. Ask him." They're putting all of that pressure on their son. Can you imagine parents being so influenced, so watered down by the fear of the Jews that they weren't even allowing themselves to celebrate with their son and acknowledge the great power that brought him his sight? And it was all because they were afraid. They were afraid of rejection. So that's the first thing that I want you to notice, the fear, that there is a major fear aspect in human experience that causes us to not be the people that we know we ought to be. Let's go back to John chapter 12, verse 43, and take a look at that specific statement. It says in verse 43, John 12, verse 43, it says, "For they loved the praise of men more than the praise of God." So we have the next thing taking place. The first one was the fear that I just suggested, and now we have verse 43, love, what they love. Now, nobody wants to be rejected, and simultaneously, everybody wants a certain type of glory. Now, just to give you a little bit more insight into the word praise here, I didn't look at the other versions. I'm using the King James, but some of the other versions may have the word glory there. The context talks a lot about glory. We've been talking a lot about it last week because Jesus is talking a lot about glory. If you just take a look at chapter 12, when he's talking about the Father, he actually says to the Father specifically in verse 28, "Father, glorify thy name." So glory is within the context, and glory is a type of exaltation. There's a power and a spirit in the glory, and everybody wants to receive some type of attention and approval, and that is, in a certain sense, fit in and also get a uniqueness or a special acknowledgement at the same time. And that's what's happening here. They were afraid of being cast out. They're afraid of being rejected, and they also wanted to fit in with the people that were around them. Now, this is every single one of us. There is no human that is exempt from this human drive, this human desire, this human need. And like I said a moment ago, we may be better at it than we used to be, or maybe when we were first Christians, it was hard to talk more about Jesus. But the whole point is we're called to be like those insane people. No one wants to be called, I use the term, those crazy, Bible-thumping people. Nobody wants that title, and that is a derogatory type of term to get people to shut up. That's really what it's going. I tell my kids not to say that, by the way. That is exactly what people want Christians to do, is to keep their mouth shut. They don't want to be exposed. And the reason why, it was just experiencing this whole book of John and the way John describes Jesus. Jesus is the Word, and the Word has power. And you just talking about Jesus does something to people. It makes their bones feel weird. It actually changes the whole atmosphere in the room when you start talking about the power of the Christ. That's what grace even is. So there's two kinds of glory that we can receive. And the point of the lesson today is to get us to look in the mirror and acknowledge this need, this human characteristic. Because whenever we are having conversations with people, we are constantly reading them. I'm going to give you just a little bit of research on this subject. It's really interesting stuff, actually. There's a book called Social, and we have amazing technology that measures brainwave activity and all these things, and different parts of the brain start to become activated during certain situations. And humans actually have this amazing skill called mentalizing. And mentalizing, all it is whenever you're having a conversation with somebody, and we do it even with other drivers. You know why whenever someone cuts you off, you think that they are your enemy and they're out to get you? It's because we mentalize. They did something to us, and therefore we start treating them like an enemy. And you can't even see their face. And it might be just somebody who's just kind of, a really nice person, and we start treating them like they're a wretch. And we have no idea. And that's a very common thing here in California because of traffic. And whenever we're talking to people, we're constantly doing amazingly complex calculations in our brain to try to decide the movement of the eyebrows and the face and the color and the way the mouth is moving. We do it without even thinking about it because it's like a human superpower. Not even animals. A lot of animals do it too, but humans have like a superpower of being able to do this. And children, when children are asked about themselves, when you ask them, what kind of person are you? Are you a good artist? If you ask them, are you tall? Or, ask them about their qualities. They don't actually have a sense of self yet. You know what is activated whenever a child is asked about themselves? They turn on the mentalizing part of the brain. They're answering the question based off of what others have told them. So that's important to understand for parents. Tell your kids how great they are, but be calm with that. They don't want to think they're too great. But when they're asked that question, they answer it, well, Mom says I'm a good artist. And what they hear throughout their childhood ends up becoming their identity. And then when you become adults, that is pretty much what we are. That is our identity, what we grew up with. And pretty much it's hardwired within us. And so when we're talking to people, when we're engaging with people, it is extremely difficult and complicated to be able to override that mentalizing system where we're trying to understand what other people think about us in that conversation. Everyone does it. Now, it's like a Trojan horse effect because most people think that they don't. Most people think they don't care what other people think. But it is hardwired within us. And if you think that you don't, you're just flat out false. You do. Biologically, you do. I want to show you an example of that from the book of Galatians, chapter 2. So go with me, please, to the book of Galatians, chapter 2. In the book of Galatians, we have one of the epistles of Paul, written to the churches in the region of Galatia. Now, Galatia was a region, so there would have been probably multiple churches that would have received this letter. And there were some problems taking place. Paul had to defend his own apostleship, and he had to help them remember to honor the original nature of the gospel. And the biggest problem during this period of time was the Jewish Christians were trying to bring in the law of Moses, and the Apostle Paul had to set them straight on this matter. And he actually brings up a specific scenario that took place, and he mentions some people by name as a result of something that was happening. Now, I'm going to read with you Galatians chapter 2, verses 11 through 13. We're going to read that, and then we're going to just take a step back and observe a little bit more of the more broad context. But let's read it together now. Galatians chapter 2, verse 11, it says, "But when Peter was come to Antioch, I withstood him to the face, because he was to be blamed. For before that certain came from James. He did eat with the Gentiles, but when they were come, he withdrew and separated himself, fearing them which were of the circumcision. And the other Jews dissembled likewise with him, insomuch that Barnabas also was carried away with their dissimulation." So I made the statement just a moment ago. Now, I'm not claiming or going to say that you're not working on it. That's not what I'm going to say. And, you don't want to make too broad of statements, but I want to just make it clear that as humans, we do care what other people think. That is just a part of us. And I wanted to also mention that you may be working on it, and you may be more advanced than others, but the whole point of what we're doing right now is we want to have the capacity and the commitment to refine our ability to be bold no matter what, regardless of who may be around us and who may be in the room. And it may have been a bit bold for me to say, if you don't think that you're one of these people, then you were just flat out false. And that might cause a little bit of dissonance in your brain. You're like, no. Maybe everyone else in the room, preacher, but not me. And so I just want to make this point that even Peter had trouble. And Barnabas had trouble. And you know what happened as a result of Peter and Barnabas allowing the fancy rich boy Jews? I know it's Paul calls them the Jews that were somewhat. I like the way it's written in the King James. The Jews who thought they were themselves somewhat, who walked into the assembly and were spying on the liberty that these Christians were experiencing. What happened was Peter and Barnabas and their buddies were having no trouble eating with the Gentiles, hanging out with the Gentiles, give them a high five when they walk in the room, having conversations with them, feeling good. But as soon as some other type of people start to walk in the room, what did they do? They started to drift back from the Gentiles. Now that was something that was so contrary to what God says in the gospel that the Apostle Paul actually makes the claim here in verse 11 that he withstood Peter to the face. You stop and think about that for a second. Peter was the man. Like, he was the ultimate disciple of Jesus. That's the way a lot of people would have looked at it during this period of time. Now, he was the one who got to see the transfiguration. He's the one who got to see the little girl raised from the dead. Peter, James, and John. It was just those three. Even of the 12, he was the main one even of those three. He's the one that Jesus would say, Peter, I'm talking straight to you right now. He's the one who stood up on the day of Pentecost and preached the gospel. He's also the one who opened the door by the power of the Holy Spirit to even bring Gentiles into the fold in Acts chapter 10 when he saw the vision of the sheep with the animals and all that. Now, Peter was selected to be one of the primary recipients of these things. And for Paul to have to approach him, do you think that would have been easy for Paul? That would be tough. And we see a lot of these different things kind of taking place. We see, first off, Peter being influenced by some of the other Jews. And did you notice, you can reread it right now. Verse 13, we can notice in verse 13. And the other Jews dissembled likewise with him. That's tough stuff when you stop and think about it. Okay? Here's the reason why. Imagine yourself in a first century assembly. Okay? Like really. Who's everyone looking at for the example? Who do you think? Peter. If Peter's in the room, whatever Peter does is going to influence most of the people. Wouldn't you say? So it's interesting and bizarre that what I'm talking about right now, what I'm preaching about, is really complicated. Being human is tough. I tell that to my kids all the time. I'm sorry. Being human is tough. Because if we observe somebody else, now, generally speaking, the same thing is true here now. I mean, a lot of people may look at the preacher, and that happens to be me, and want to, if the preacher is doing something, or another leader, somebody who is living a certain way or doing something, some type of behavior activity, that is usually a type of example. And we can be in a situation where somebody who has a type of influence is going to start to stray away from the straight and narrow pathway. And that can actually get a whole classification of people to start going in the wrong direction. So you know what the point of that is? Our fellowship has to be with the Father. We are all supposed to be helping one another. But there must absolutely, I try not to use the word absolute too much, because there's not a lot of things absolute, I mean, there's a lot of give and take, and whenever I use the word absolute, it's real. Every individual must absolutely have a personal relationship with the Scriptures and with God themselves. To be able to have a little bit of like a siren go off when they see something happening, because you can apply this when you're talking about yourself out in the world, and that's going to be difficult. It's going to be complicated. When you're out in the world, it's going to be difficult to be bold as you ought to be, because you're not going to want to be rejected, and you can be easily swayed because of the movement of the mob, or the movement of the people, the movement of certain types of people. But we actually see it taking place in the first century church with Peter, and Paul actually refers to them, those who, if you look at the context, he actually refers to them, those who seemed to be pillars. They're supposed to be pillars, and even Peter was doing this. So you can't take anything for granted and expect that that's not going to happen even within the body of Christ. That's a huge deal. So this is a reality check for us to take into deep consideration our own knowledge and understanding of the Scriptures. The man Peter himself actually wrote about it. That's what we're doing study in on Wednesday evenings from 2 Peter. In 2 Peter chapter 1, he talks about what it takes or some of the things to do in order to make sure that you never fall, making your calling and election sure. And the things that he talks about is adding to your faith virtue, and the virtue knowledge, and knowledge temperance, and the temperance patience, and the patience godliness, and the godliness brotherly kindness, and brotherly kindness love. And mixed in all those things is a complete package of all the things that we need. And I want to point out that knowledge is one of those things. You as an individual must seek your own knowledge. You have to do your own homework. You have to burn the midnight oil in your own faith and in your own commitment with your relationship to God. Because we all want to be a part of something bigger than ourselves, but really when it's all said and done, you want to be with God more than anything. I got a couple of boys that I am tutoring right now for the kids' homeschool program. And Solomon talks about being a king, and it's an honor for a king to search out a matter from Proverbs chapter 25. And so I asked these boys, I said, so who's the king? Well, Solomon's the king. I said, well, so why did he write this? And why is it here for us to read right now? So that you can know that Solomon was seeking answers? Well, no, that's not. Why would that matter to us right now? How is that applicable to you and me right now? So I asked them, who is the king? And they said, well, Jesus said, yeah, that might be true. But who is the king of your life? Who is the only one who makes decisions in your life? Because do you do everything Jesus says? And they all said, well, no. So I said, so he ain't your king when you're not doing what he says. There's only one person in the whole world who makes your decisions. It doesn't matter what your parents say, what your parents teach you, what your parents try to get you to do. At the end of the day, when you're laying in the bed at night thinking to yourself, it's only your brain thinking and your mind and your heart and your soul, and only you have power over that. So you, as a king or a queen of your life, have all authority on what you do. Don't matter what Peter did. Don't matter what the preacher does or the elders or anybody. We all have access to this beautiful, majestic word that we have right here. Take a look at the context with me. Let's go back to chapter 1 of Galatians. You see what Paul is addressing. We're going to get to verse 10 in just a moment, but I want you to notice the context before we get to verse 10. So Galatians chapter 1, it says, in verse 6, Paul jumps right into it. In fact, of all of Paul's epistles, usually he does a little bit more of the friendly talk. Like, hey, I like you guys, I'm praying for you, grace be with you, and all that. Man, he jumps right in on his epistle to the Galatians. And he writes in verse 6, he does a little bit of that. Verse 3, he does a little bit, but it's usually more. Verse 6, he says, I marvel that you are so soon removed from him that called you into the grace of Christ unto another gospel, which is not another, but there be some that trouble you and would pervert the gospel of Christ. This is important stuff. You mean there's other gospels out there? You mean there's a such thing as false doctrine out there? You mean there's a such thing that can have us removed from the grace of Christ? That's pretty serious stuff. And then he makes this statement in verse 8. He says, but though we or an angel from heaven. Think about that now. What's Paul saying right here? Though we or an angel from heaven. Even if an angel dressed in the brightest of white clothing with a scepter in his hand comes down and tries to tell you something other than what the scriptures teach, you need to take notice. If he preaches any other gospel than that which we have preached unto you, let him be accursed, it says. Then verse 9, he says, as we said before, so say I now again, if any man preach any other gospel unto you than that which you have received, let him be accursed. That's strong language. And we can see why he would do that, because who did he have to withstand to the face? Peter, man. That's crazy when you stop and think about it. Peter. He had to have a talk with Peter. We have to love one another enough to have the difficult conversations. We have to love one another enough to help each other understand that the ways of the world is not the ways of the church, it's not the ways of God. The world, it's in some ways becoming easier because the world's going so wild and crazy. So it's getting easier to see what truth is. But it's incredibly difficult for the upcoming generations to be able to see this and understand it. And don't make the mistake of thinking that we are exempt from this lesson. So verse 10, here's what Paul says, and he uses this questioning mechanism to make the point. He says in Galatians 1 verse 10, for do I now persuade men or God? Or do I seek to please men? For if I yet please men, I should not be the servant of Christ. So going back to my metaphor of you being the only king of your life, the only one who really has the capacity to make decisions, you as the only decision maker in your life have to decide who you're really trying to please, who you're really trying to be in unity with. Despite the fear of rejection and despite the love of the glory of men. It's a lonely path, but you alone are the only one who has the capacity to make this decision. I had a thought recently that was driving me crazy. I want to share it with you as a type of example. It's a secular example, but it's something that hits close to home to Americans, really. I had a thought recently of how difficult it would have been to be a righteous person in the South during the Civil War. You know, in my own mind, in my own thought experiment, I took it even a little bit deeper, and I thought to myself, man, how difficult would it really have been to be the wife of a slave-owning man during the time of the Civil War? Can you imagine if a woman was able to pick up her Bible and read it and understand and realize this is bogus what we are doing. This is insane. This is horrifying when you take a look at what the word actually says. And people were actually trying to spin the scriptures into justifying slavery in the South. And if you were a righteous person, able to see truth, they would burn your house down in those days. They would persecute you in those days. I'm thinking to myself, man, my life is easy when I stop and think about it. How difficult would that have been to be a woman, to be a white woman in a household where out in the field just slavery, and for you to have to stand up to your husband, probably be beaten to a bloody pulp To have to make that decision and to know that you're going to have to answer to God if you are condoning of these kinds of things. Now, that is an intense thought experiment, don't you think? At least it was for me. It actually made me quiver a little bit as I'm thinking about it. I'm thinking about something. My life is easy. So if that was something, I'm sure some of those people did. I'm sure there were a small remnant, a small handful of women or men who were willing to stand up for it. And you can read about them, about church buildings being burned down and, the crosses being burnt on people's properties and that kind of stuff. That type of persecution taking place just because you want to see equality in your country. That's insane. And the fact that you would be thinking to yourself, why are you so angry with me? But isn't that the case with being a believer in Christ? Just talking about Jesus and people get mad at you. It's like, why are you angry with me? He was nothing but pure love and grace and beauty, and you're getting mad at me? It's confusing when you think about it. And you would have to be backed into the corner of righteousness and ask yourself the question when you're in that moment, because you could talk yourself out of standing up for righteousness easily by saying, well, just for the sake of peace. Remember what was spoken in the book of Jeremiah. The false prophets would preach peace, peace where there was no peace. Well, just for the sake of peace, I'm going to let this slide. Just for the sake of peace, I'm going to go ahead and not say anything about these topics because it's going to make it real awkward. You know how awkward it was when Jesus was preaching? He didn't get a lot of amens. He didn't get a lot of you tell it. He got crickets. He got the opposite of acceptance. Entire groups of people would get up and walk out of the room. That's hard. I don't know if anyone's ever done that while I was preaching. But like this fear, because public speaking is hard to do. The reason why is because of the fear of rejection. If you actually take a look at the research and trace it back to the origins of why it's so hard, it's because you're standing up in front of a bunch of people, and if you get rejected, that's hard. That's not easy to deal with. And the thought, even enters my mind if somebody gets up and walks out, it's like, was it something I said? You never know. Jesus had entire groups of people walk away while he was teaching. How do you think he felt? Not to mention the fact that he was butchered for what he preached, beaten, and hung on a cross. So talking about that little thought experiment added a couple of minutes to my sermon, but I thought that might be useful for you. Because, man, that would have been tough. But here's the reality. Being a Christian is tough. Let's go to chapter 2 and verse 20. Let's take a look at Paul's statement. Now, this is well within the context of what we're talking about right now. In order for Paul to actually have to make the change, and Paul, of all people, would know about this because at one time he was Mr. Popular, he was Mr. Cool, he was Mr. Go Get 'em from the Jewish perspective, and he had to make a massive change. And suddenly the hunter became the hunted, and this is how he did it. Verse 20, he says, I am crucified with Christ. In other words, it ain't about me anymore. It's not about what I want. It's not about what I think. It's not about my aspirations. It's about the aspirations of the kingdom of Jesus. So I am crucified with Christ. Nevertheless, I live. Yet not I, but Christ lives in me. And the life that I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith of the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. So it's not my life anymore. I'm not even alive anymore. It's Jesus living within me. And that is what's determining my behavior. That is what's making me go, is that energy and that strength from him. So we go from being conformed to the world, being silent in the world, not confessing Christ for fear of being thrown out of the synagogue, in a conformity to being transformed. I know a lot of you can quote this with me. Romans chapter 12 and verse 2. He says, be not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind. That's exactly what Paul is talking about when he says, I am crucified with Christ, nevertheless I live. He is transformed by the renewing of his mind, not worried about what happens to the body, what happens to his popularity, not what happens to his prestige or even his riches and his wealth. Just like that woman that I was talking about, the wife of the slave owner. She would have to do that which is right, knowing that she would probably be hurt physically because of it. And I pray for people like that throughout the world who are stuck in similar situations, how difficult that would be. So I'm going to take you now to Psalm 27 and notice David's perspective. And this is inspiring, and it's a verse that I have placed in here for the design of giving you something to hang on to, something to think about, something to exercise your memory with, to have this in your mind, and something for you to stay driven to always do the right thing. I love what David does here. And you know that David was one of these people who, in the name of righteousness, would have to live or walk the path alone. He, even one of the instances in his life, some of his own people, I'm talking about like the little army that he had when he was running away for his life from King Saul. Even King David and his boys that were with him talked about stoning him because of some of the things that took place. So David knew what it was like to be alone. And this was his perspective. This is how David was able to be David. This is how David became King David. Psalm 27 verse 1, it says, the Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the strength of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? When the wicked, even mine enemies and my foes, came upon me to eat up my flesh, they stumbled and fell. Though a host should encamp against me, my heart shall not fear. Though war should rise against me, in this will I be confident. And the truth is, we are in a war. We are in a spiritual war. And even if people picked up arms to fight against you, you should be able to have this in your heart so that you never become silent because of fear or loving the praise of men more than the praise of God, because the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared to the glory that shall be revealed in us. So if you have not made the decision to become a disciple, come now while we stand and sing.